As Capcom entered the new millennium, they were leaving Resident Evil in a really good spot. The original trilogy of Resident Evils 1, 2, and 3 really defined the console and set the series up for huge success going forward. However, there is still one more game on the original PlayStation that we have not talked about, and that is Resident Evil Survivor. Resident Evil Survivor is a really interesting game. It is the first one in the series that really tried to push the genre boundaries of Resident Evil, taking a first-person perspective and even dipping its toes into the light gun genre. So how did it go? What's the story behind it? And why don't people talk about it as much as this beloved trilogy on the PlayStation? Is Survivor a great game to cap off the PlayStation 1 era of Resident Evil, or is it better left in obscurity? Let's find out.
Resident Evil Survivor.
Resident Evil Survivor was released in late January 2000 exclusively for the PlayStation 1, just 1 week before the release of Code Veronica on the technically superior Sega Dreamcast. It is the first original Resident Evil game not developed by Capcom, but instead by Toze, a long-standing game development company that has largely acted as a support studio for various other games. They would go on to co-develop Resident Evil 0 with Capcom, and have a hand in various other Resident Evil titles in the future. A goal when developing Survivor was to test the marketability of Resident Evil as a brand across multiple genres, and bringing the zombie survival franchise to a first-person, light gun genre seems like it would be a good fit, especially when compared to games like House of the Dead that already showed it could be successful. It's important to note early that Resident Evil Survivor was designed as a game to be compatible with Namco's Gun-Con, a popular light gun for the PlayStation 1. And this is the case for the game in Japan and Europe. However, the US version of the game dropped the Gun-Con support. You have to use the D-pad to move around the crosshair and hold down R1 to aim. There is no confirmed reason as to why the US version dropped Gun-Con support, but a popular theory was a response to the Columbine High School massacre. Coupled with the fact that the US version was released a staggering 7 months after the Japanese launch and 5 months after the European release, I think that could make sense here. For this review, I only played my US copy that I have, so if you've played this with a light gun, let me know how it is. The controls for this game here are not the best. Moving the cursor with the D-pad is jittery, you can't look up or down, and your movement is limited to tank-like controls. Aiming is just awful for fast enemies like dogs and the leaping hunters and lickers. You can use L1 as a special targeting feature, as it's listed in the manual as a good feature to lock onto an enemy to anticipate where they will be. But oftentimes when I tried it, it would instead lock onto doors, staircases, or items on the ground when I needed it to work in dire situations. While not ever in the arcade itself, much of Survivor plays out like an arcade light gun shooting game. The entire game has to be played in one sitting, with 4 continues available to you to try and beat one run of the game. There's no save rooms and no ink ribbons here. You have unlimited handgun ammo, so the scarcity of resources is not as big of a burden here as in previous titles. What differs though is in its approach. Instead of being on rails, Survivor lets you freely roam, albeit a small linear segment, but enough that it lets you have choice in how you progress. You can't explore everything the game has to offer on one route. Sometimes you'll go through a door and...
Oh no!
And that's one thing that is a little interesting in here, is how they tackle replayability for such a short-run playtime game. It has so much of its arcade influence in here that having these other routes is actually how you discover the full range of the story Survivor is trying to tell.
The story in Survivor is kind of bad. It's set just after the destruction of Raccoon City. We play as a man with amnesia who crashes a helicopter on an umbrella-controlled town called Sheena Island, where an outbreak of the T-virus has ravaged the area. Your goal is to regain your memories and escape. Playing through the game multiple times to see all the cutscenes really helps bring this story together, but it's really not special whatsoever. If you only play through it one time, you're going to be lost on certain characters and their motivations. It is kind of cool to see the island is basically a tyrant factory, but a lot of it in its writing really just becomes too silly for Resident Evil. Classic files can still be found, but they really lack polish in their writing. Survivor also has some of the worst line delivery in the franchise I've ever heard.
Vincent? It's me, your mother. Vincent, please. Listen to your mother. I want you to leave Umbrella.
A self-destruction sequence, leaving on a train, the escorting of lost children, it just feels like a boneless Resident Evil 2. They borrowed too much from it, and didn't really try to do anything too unique or even better than what the stories of the series have told so far. I can't be bothered to genuinely care about our protagonist, who you don't even know who he is until way late into the game, and even that doesn't make much sense unless you replay the game a few more times to see all the cutscenes and meet all the side characters. I had this guy shoot at me through a window. I don't even know who he is. Based on my choices, he never showed up again. Just some random asshole shooting at me from a window. Survivor does a good job at capturing that feel and look of a Resident Evil game, however. The menu is just the same layout as one of the item boxes, and the menu sound effects are the same as in prior games. Survivor's setting is dark and eerie, yet familiar for returning fans. Zombies, dogs, lickers, hunters, even tyrants all make appearances here, as well as first aid sprays and, you guessed it, herbs.
All right.
While not as sharp as its predecessors, it still gets the job done. The game uses a lot of assets from Resident Evil 1 and 2, and it shows. The same enemy models and even background ambient noises like dog barks and gunfire litter this game. The locations showcase some greatest hits, quote-unquote, of familiar places like dark city streets, a mansion, and underground Umbrella Labs. The cutscenes are fine, but oftentimes they are too dark to really make out what's happening. It makes sense for this to be a lower budget title when compared to the first party releases, but you gotta give it some slack for experimenting with an interesting first-person twist to this classic series. A single playthrough of Resident Evil Survivor is about 2 to 3 hours for a first-time player. Going in blind and on normal mode, I did pretty well. Early on in the game, it's quite simple to just spam your handgun with unlimited ammo. It's possible to get very lucky depending on the enemy AI, which is very inconsistent. Generally, after you finish a player-chosen segment, you get a checkpoint if you die. My first death wasn't until I was at the final checkpoint, which is in front of a mansion with 2 hunters just charging at you immediately. And the hunters are the hardest enemies in the game to me. They just take too much to put down, move too quickly, and are quite unpredictable. 3 of my 4 continues were lost on hunters. On my last life, no continues left, I was face to face with the final boss. With it all on the line, I prepared for a final confrontation, and I lost. And when you lose, the game allows you to save your game, and lets you continue? Huh, let's see what happens.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't finish this game. Because right at that moment, the option was to just restart at the very beginning, and the slog that this game is, I could not bring myself to do it.
While giving you the benefit of starting over with your current weapons and items, this just sucked. I was not prepared or ready to dive right back into this game, basically from ground zero. But I know the next time I try, I will beat it for sure. The edge of having better weapons earlier, coupled with knowing how the game works, is one thing. The other thing? I didn't realize you could run. I played the entire game by walking. The game's controls don't tell you how to run, just that moving forward makes you walk/run, and I didn't think much of it. All those times I was dodging zombies and tyrants, I was just walking around them. Honestly, I'm mad. But if I ever decide to pick up this game again for an evening, it's all over.
Resident Evil Survivor is actually the first in a small sub-series of games with the Resident Evil franchise. Of course, Survivor being the first, but there's also Resident Evil Survivor 2, which was only released in Japan and Europe, that is very heavily based on the Code Veronica storylines and characters. From there, the third game in the series is actually Dino Stalker, the same formula but with the Dino Crisis characters instead of Resident Evil. The fourth and final game there is going to be Resident Evil Dead Aim. I don't currently own it. That one actually does support light guns. Maybe we'll get to it at some point. But this also was really influential for other spin-off Resident Evil titles. Many may already be familiar with the Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles on the Wii. More on-rails shooting, but still taking Resident Evil in the first-person perspective to really push what this genre can do. It can be successful. It might take some time to get there, but its influence is still seen throughout its series. And let's not forget that Resident Evil 7, the game that helped jumpstart this series into critical acclaim and popularity in the modern era, also has that first-person perspective, the first for the mainline series. Get the hell out of here.
Resident Evil Survivor ultimately feels like a low-budget, and at its worst, low-quality version of what makes classic Resident Evil so great. It's bold for trying a new style, but it lacks in polish, has sluggish controls, weaker writing and presentation, and just real monotonous gameplay that makes this one kinda rough. It definitely benefits from being a shorter game, a fun afternoon to see a cool spin on Resident Evil in its early days, but beyond that, this one is best left on the shelf.
You've got to help my brother! Please!
I promise.
Holy shit, it's Street Fighter.
At the end of the day, it's really hard to recommend Resident Evil Survivor. A lot of it in its writing and tone and structure really just feels like a watered-down version of what made the series so great so far. And of course, there are a lot of factors that get into that. And I do really appreciate this game for trying to do a different genre and really inspiring other games that came after it that do the first-person or light gun experience much better than this one. Baby steps for sure, but it does still have its importance, and it's still fun to look at when seeing the whole history of Resident Evil, on the original PlayStation at least. But what did you think about Resident Evil Survivor? Have you played it before? Have you actually tried it with the light gun support as well? Feel free to let me know, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day.
Ah, the nice classic intro. Oh? Alright, let's put some headphones on and hear this great PlayStation quality music.
In 1998,
Why is it so loud? What is this mixing? It just keeps going! I can't hear anything!